In the garage of Dr. Frank Conrad, on November 2nd, 1920, the first scheduled pre-advertised radio program in the United States went on the air. Station KDKA was broadcasting returns of the presidential race on the evening of Election Day. From a humble beginning in a Pittsburgh garage to the sumptuous studios of the national radio networks in New York, Chicago, and Hollywood, these are the years we refer to as the golden age of radio.
Here's the Manhattan merry-go-round that brings you the bright side of life, that whirls you in music to all the big night spots of New York town, to hear the top songs of the week sung so clearly you can understand every word and sing in your time.
Hal Kemp on the air for Griffin.
It's time to shine. Shine your shoes anyway.
Tony Home Permanent presents...
This is Nora Drake.
The Golden Age of Radio is brought to you by Burritt Mutual Savings Bank, serving Central Connecticut since 1889. We'll join Dick Bertel, Ed Corcoran, and their special guest in just a moment. And now the host of the Golden Age of Radio, Dick Bertel.
Good evening, and with me once again is radio collector Ed Corcoran. Ed, we have a special guest tonight, don't we?
We sure do, Dick. A star of the movies, television, and as we will find out in a few minutes, a big star on radio, too, Dick. Why don't you tell everybody who it is?
Well, of course, we're talking about Vincent Price. Vincent, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Golden Age of Radio.
Thank you, Dick. I feel like I'm back home.
That's the reason that you're on this program, because I knew that you were coming to Hartford, and naturally we thought of asking you to appear on the program, but usually someone whose motion picture career, whose theater career has perhaps overshadowed a radio career would be hesitant to talk about radio, but not you.
No, I still think radio is probably the greatest entertainment medium ever invented. It made the audience work. And I think television audiences don't have to work, and that's why they fall asleep half of the time.
Well, you worked in radio for a long time, right up until, I guess, the Hollywood studios closed in the early 60s.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, you've just returned from England, where you are filming a motion picture, but you did some radio work there.
Yes, they call me up from the BBC. You know, radio in England is still enormous, and it always will be, because people love radio over there. And they do some superb dramas and music and documentary programs, really marvelous. And they asked me if I'd come and do a storytelling show, great short stories that have to do with the macabre, with the unusual, with the strange.
We have received the impression in doing this series, Vincent, that some of the motion picture and theater actors look down on radio and radio actors. In fact, it was a very definite impression that we have received from some actors.
Really? Well, you've come to the wrong fellow. If you want me to look that. You know, I go out every year on a lecture tour all over the country, and have for 15 years, and I've lectured in over 200 colleges and universities around the country, and I'm always getting asked by young actors, how do you start in the business? You know, what is the best training you can have? Well, we don't have the marvelous repertory companies that England has, and we don't have state theater as some other countries have. So there is really no place for the young actor to go. But in the colleges is always a radio and television department. And my advice to the young actor always is get on radio. Do as many dramas as you possibly can on radio, on your local show. And I know that some of the colleges I've been to have really started to begin to do some of the great radio dramas and to write new material for themselves. Because it imposes on the actor the necessity to create everything, to create the sets, to create the costumes, to create the expressions, to create everything. And I think one of the great drawbacks of television is that so much of it is just sort of visualized radio shows, where they ought to really write television shows. And, they run out of material. It's a big monster. But radio had superb writers, absolute extraordinary writers, and I don't think television has that all the time.
Well, you seem to have this perception for radio's gift, radio's ability to create moods, to create sets, because as a young actor in New York, I believe, you decided to work at least anonymously in radio.
Well, I was doing a play. My first play in New York was a big hit. It was one of those extraordinary breaks that you get or you don't get, and it was a play opposite Helen Hayes, and it ran for 3 years. And there was no chance of sort of going out and doing other plays. I would go out in the summer. We'd lay off for a month, and I'd go do summer stock in Skowhegan, Maine, or all around here. And that was experience. But I felt that the one experience that I really could afford and get in New York was to work on soap operas. And marvelous things like John's Other Wife, extraordinary soap opera stories. And I would go work without a name, without anything, because I was not part of the radio group, but I could get jobs because I was in a hit play. And I would take advantage of that. And I worked on radio every single week, and maybe would do 5 or 6 shows a week, playing in these different kinds of radio dramas. And I learned my business, how you really create a part orally. And it was exciting and wonderful experience.
We were talking, Vincent, before going on the air about some of the programs in which you appeared. You have some of these shows in your own collection, but one series in which you starred for some 4 years was The Saint. And I don't believe you've heard that series in 25 years.
I really haven't. And there are lots of people around the country collecting old radio shows and putting them on tape and really bringing them up in sound and doing a marvelous job. And I've been able to collect about, I think I must have done well over 2,000 radio shows in my life. And I don't have very many of them because it cost a lot of money to have them put on record, and you didn't get paid very much in radio. So unless it was a very special show, you didn't order it taken off the air.
Of course, this takes us back to the days before tape, doesn't it, Ed? When actors, in order to hear themselves, would have to hire an outside recording studio.
Oh, yes, and it was very expensive. I mean, if I had wanted The Saint taken off, it would have cost me about $60. And it was a lot of money in those days, because you weren't paid that much. I did have taken off some of them. Most of the Lux Radio Theater, which was all the actors gave their services to Lux Radio Theater because it was then given to the Motion Picture Home and Motion Picture Relief. And they always gave us the recordings of those, and I have all the ones I did with Betty Davis and Herbert Marshall, and really superb actors, that great memories they are.
Vincent Price doesn't have to go any farther to hear The Saint, does he?
No, we have a very
Can't
good
Can't believe it.
opening theme, the commercials, the whole bit, Dick. And it's really a great show, and I think the theme itself should turn back the clock a few years.
The Adventures of the Saint, starring Vincent Price. The Saint, based on characters created by Leslie Charteris and known to millions from books, magazines, and motion pictures. The Robin Hood of modern crime now comes transcribed to radio, starring Hollywood's brilliant and talented actor Vincent Price as The Saint.
Well, of course, you appeared in so many of the anthologies, Lux Radio Theater, of course, because you were in so many of the movies. But what were some of the other programs that our radio audience might remember, Ed?
Well, there was the Lady Esther Screen Guild Players and the Hollywood Star Time and of course suspense and shows like that.
On one of these shows like Hollywood Star Time, when would you begin rehearsal for a program?
It was a very long rehearsal period, and you really worked. You worked, maybe from 10 in the morning right straight through until you did the show maybe at 9 o'clock at night. And it was long hours of work. The extraordinary thing was the care that went into radio shows. There was a kind of perfection about the radio actor that was extraordinary. It was a very small group of people, and I always felt myself enormously privileged that I was able to join that group, because they didn't take everybody in by a long shot.
Well, we've learned that.
If you liked radio as much as I did, you depended on these people. People like Lorene Tuttle and Hans Conried, and these people who could do anything. They really could do anything. I mean, suddenly if somebody got sick who was playing a Greek, you'd say, well, Hans, how about it? And he was a Greek in 2 seconds, or he was Russian, or whatever you wanted to do.
Tell the story about Lorene Tuttle.
It really is extraordinary. And, you mentioned earlier today when we were talking about that she is famous for having done so many parts on one show. It may have been this show. 20th Century Fox, when I was under contract as a movie actor to them, I had written in my contract that I wanted the freedom to do radio. Now, there was no television at that time. And they were very sticky about it. They were really kind of angry that I should want this. And I said, I feel radio is my training ground, and that's where I want to work. But they let me do it. And so, of all the contract players, I was the only one who was allowed to do it. Anytime I wanted to do it, and it didn't interfere with their films. Well, then they finally had their own radio show on the air, and I can't remember what it was called. I think Hedda Hopper was the MC.
There was one called 20th Century Presents or something like that.
That's what it was. And we did a lot of pictures. I did The Lodger and, different things like this. Anyway, there was one show where they had 2 little starlets, little pretty girls who were very sweet and who were up-and-coming stars. And they were on the show, and then there was one of their character women on the show, and none of them could do radio, because radio is not just getting up and reading. It is acting, And they couldn't do it. And Lorene was playing the mother on it. So after about 2 days of rehearsal, they suddenly told one of the little starlets that she would have to go, so Lorene took that part. Then about another day, and they got rid of the next little starlet, and Lorene took her part. And it ended up with Lorene playing, I think, 5 or 6 different parts.
Incredible.
And it ended up, Lorene was a great friend of mine, and she had been the leading lady on The Saint for a long, long time with me. It ended up with my being absolutely hysterical, because she was playing a woman 80, a woman 50, a woman 40, a child 13. Just any part that came up, and it was only Lorene and myself in a show that should have been 7 people. And I finally had to work on a separate mic because I couldn't look at her. Because she changed the whole characterization. Absolutely brilliant she was. Brilliant.
You're listening to the Golden Age of Radio with Dick Bertel and the recordings of Ed Corcoran. Brought to you by Burritt Mutual Savings Bank, serving Central Connecticut since 1889. And by WTIC, Hartford, Connecticut.
You mentioned the Lodger in our conversation a few minutes ago, and I see that on Hollywood Star Time, Ed, Vincent Price appeared as in both the Lodger and Hangover Square, and I'm thinking back to the fact that you did not appear in either film.
No, it was Laird Cregar. I did Laird's first film with him, which was a thing called The Hudson's Bay was the name of it. And Laird and I became very great friends, and then he died, very young. I think he was only 31 or something. And he had done The Lodger, and he had done Hangover Square. And after he died, I think that's when they did these shows on the air. So I got to play the parts. And it was an extraordinary feeling playing a part that was that much identified with that man.
And that started off a career of the macabre. Haven't you kind of gone in that direction ever since? Not all the time, but many roles are geared that way.
Yeah, sort of. Either that or comedy. I love comedy. And it's very easy to turn the macabre into comedy. You
That's
know,
right.
It really is. I think perhaps if those films that I have done that have been horror films have been successful, it's because I have a little bit of tongue-in-cheek. Because I think I've got to find them as funny as the audience does sometimes.
Our guest is Vincent Price, and we're talking about Vincent's radio career, which goes back, I guess, to the 30s. Would you say, Vincent?
Yes, well into the 30s.
When you were doing those soap operas on an anonymous basis in
That's
New
right.
York.
And I did the Rudy Valley show and the first show Edgar Bergen was ever on with Charlie.
Oh, really?
Oh, it was tremendous because you fell in love with this dummy, and when he'd set him down, he was something dead sitting there, It was really frightening because this thing came to life. He was brilliant, Edgar. I got to tell you a marvelous radio story. For years and years, we always listened to Jack Benny. Who didn't? Really the greatest, I think, single performer on radio that ever was. I mean, just absolutely brilliant. He could take 10 minutes of dead air and make you fall on your face laughing. And if you remember, Ronald Coleman was always the next-door neighbor of the Bennys. Mm-hmm. And the Bennys, who were so chintzy and cheap and, never had enough of anything, were always going over to the Colemans to borrow a cup of sugar or egg or something. So anyway, lap dissolve a few years. This shows you how much in love with radio I was. I did a film with Ronald Coleman, and he and his wife asked my wife and myself over to dinner. And we knew where Jack Benny lived. We'd always known where Jack Benny lives, one of the sort of landmarks of Hollywood. So we got in the car, all dressed up, went next door to Jack Benny. Went up to the front door, next door to Jack Benny, rang the bell and said, Mr. and Mrs. Coleman are expecting us, because they didn't live there at all. Not at all, nor did we know where the hell they lived. And we finally had to call the Screen Actors Guild to find out where the Colemans lived. I always took it for granted they lived next door to Jack Benny, And in his basement was a vault with all those chains around it. Oh, marvelous, man. Oh, dear.
Our guest tonight is Vincent Price on the Golden Age of Radio. Vincent, you did work in the Golden Age. I'm delighted to learn that you are contemplating a series for the BBC in radio. You're one of the very few people that we've been able to interview on this program who is considering furthering his radio career.
Yeah, I love it. I really love it. And I really think that the commercial people, whoever they are, who say whether we work or don't work, are making a big mistake. California, where you drive enormous distances, I have that radio on all the time. And I'd like to hear something good.
You were talking about Lux Radio Theater, and this was probably the biggest radio dramatic production on the air, would you say?
Yes, it was really extraordinary. Cecil B. DeMille was the host, and William Keighley and different people, very distinguished directors. And the fact that all of the money went to the Actors Fund was very impressive. Besides, I suppose it had one of the biggest listening audiences of all time. And these dramas were rehearsed like plays. You rehearsed a full week. And I think some of the most exciting ones I did were The Letter with Betty Davis and Herbert Marshall. And that was kind of an extraordinary story because Betty, being as volatile a lady as she is and a wiggler, and wiggling was something you weren't meant to do in radio because you had to keep your distance from that mic. They finally built an iron circle around the mic to keep Betty's distance away from it because she'd fall in love with it, and she'd get up to it, and it goes pop and hiss and all of the things that you do when you get too close to a mic, which I'm probably doing right now.
Did you ever find that any of your colleagues from the motion picture screen were frightened of radio?
Terrified of it. Most of the stars at Fox, and I mean the great stars like Tyrone Power and people like that, when Fox had its own show, there were so few of them who knew how to work on radio. They didn't know how to read. They couldn't sustain it. They couldn't give it a variety. And it had to have a variety and a tremendous excitement to it. Even if it was a very calm performance, it had to have an inner excitement.
I think if I were to single out one show, one performance, in which I best remember Vincent Price on the radio, that would have to be from the suspense series, Three Skeleton Key.
Oh, yeah. Brilliant show. The young fellow who wrote it, I challenged him to write it. He was sort of trying to get into movies, and his name was James Poe, and he's since won about 5 Academy Awards. And he couldn't really get started. He couldn't get off the ground. He and his wife were great friends of ours. And I said, why don't you write me a radio show? He said, I don't know how to write for radio. And I said, what do you mean you don't know how to write for radio? You write. You create visual effects. You do, you know. So he searched around. He found this short story, and he adapted it to radio. And it really made his reputation, this story, because it became one of the great radio shows ever done.
I would say one of the 3 great radio shows.
Yeah, we were talking about that before we went on the air, Dick. I think it was Sorry Wrong Number,
Agnes
Lion
Moynihan
versus the Ants,
yeah,
and Three Skeleton Key.
Yes.
This is on a suspense. These were the 3 top shows
I
of all
think so
time.
too. I think so too.
Yeah, it never was made into a film or a TV show.
No, it should be.
It would be very difficult. I think, again, the imagination is even better than seeing it.
Where are you going to get that many trained rats? Except in New York, of course.
This is a suspense show, and the scene is a lighthouse way out in the dregs of the Pacific, very isolated lighthouse, and there are 3 men in there, and they're just waiting for something to happen, and something really does happen very shortly.
Suspense.
Down we went, racing down the stone stairs, taking them 3 and 4 at a time. Scared? You bet we were scared.
Suppose you get the windows, maybe they can climb. We don't know.
All right, Chief, but hurry, hurry. We made it. We lay across the trap, exhausted, while below us the rats took over the entire tower. And then the rats, quite suddenly, were silent. And then I heard it. And then I saw the sky and the stars. The rats were gone. I went to the glass. Out there on the water, a small freighter, a banana boat, came softly and innocently at us. The light was out. They didn't know. I wanted to open the windows, to call out to them, to warn them somehow, but I was afraid. What if the rats were hiding from me, tricking me? And so I waited. She grounded very softly on a reef not 200 yards from the quay. Grounded so gently that the man playing the cornet, was he a passenger, a crewman off watch, didn't even stop playing. They tried washing her back off. I could have told them to save their fuel. The tide was rising, would have floated her free. And I waited. That's all. That's the story. The sun came up and there wasn't a rat on the whole quay. Every last one of that terrible army had deserted us, gone back to sea on their new ship. Life on Three Skeleton Key isn't bad these days, but sometimes when I see a strange vessel approaching, I get a little nervous. Can you blame me? Somewhere on the seas there's a little banana boat without a crew. That is, without a human crew.
Vincent Price, I can't tell you how much we've enjoyed getting together with you on the golden age of radio and learning how much you do love radio.
I really love it. When we finally did the last suspense show in Hollywood, and it was all the people that you know who've been on every show you've ever heard from Hollywood in the old days. And we were all sitting around, and finally Virginia Gregg, who was one of the great ladies of radio, and she looked around, she said, "Isn't it awful? She said, isn't it awful? She said, oh, God, if only television was going out and radio was coming in.
And it is true, too. We all felt that. Vincent Price, thank you so much for being with us. This is Dick Bertel.
And this is Ed Corcoran.
Good night.
The Golden Age of Radio with Dick Bertel and the recordings of Ed Corcoran is brought to you by WTIC and by Burritt Mutual Savings Bank, serving Central Connecticut since 1889. With engineering and technical assistance by Bob Shirago, The Golden Age of Radio is produced by Brian Hartnett. This is Al Tersey.
You're listening to the Old Time Radio Show on 71K News Talk Radio. Now back to Denver's Old Time Radio history buff, John Dunning.
And I am very happy today to have Frank Nelson. We all know this anyway, but Frank Nelson had a frequent but indefinable role on the Benny program. He played a floor walker, of course, in the Christmas show, which they did every year. He played a waiter in restaurants, in supermarkets. He played a salesman. He played a ticket seller at the railroad station. But on all of these parts, he had one common denominator and one personality trait. No matter what the situation, he was always Jack Benny's arch enemy. And that one magic word that he uttered every week always sent the audience into hysterics. Frank Nelson, are you on the phone?
Yes.
Yes? You're still doing that for McDonald's.
You know, I just, no, I'm not just doing it for McDonald's now. I just finished doing it. I did it up until about the 10th of January. And the way I answered you just with the yes, you know, without stretching it or anything, I have to tell you a story about a director that came on the Benny Show at a particular point in time. And so we were sitting around the table reading, and Jack said, oh, Mr. And I said, yes. And we went on through the thing, and when we were through and going to do the rehearsal on mic, he walked up to me and he said, Frank, don't do that. And I said, what? He said, don't do that. I said, don't do what? He said, well, you know how you said the yes. He said, don't do that. I said, oh, all right. So get up there, and Jack said, oh, Mister, and I said, yes. Jack said, what are you doing? I said, well, the director told me not to do that. And Jack turned around, and he said, have you ever seen my show or heard my show? And the director said, well, no, I haven't. He said, well, he's been doing that for 30 years. That's what I pay him to do.
It was probably the most famous one word in certainly that I can think of in all of the old-time radio I've heard.
Well, it lasted for 38 years, so I guess it had something.
38 years? Well, you must have started on it very early then.
Well, I started with Jack actually on June 1st, 1934. I wasn't doing the yes then. I was just doing parts with him, and I'd say about 6 months into my association with him, one week I happened to stretch it, and the writers the next week said, hey, we're going to try that again. I said, try what? They said, well, you remember you stretched out a yes and it got a laugh last week? And I had to think about it, and I said, oh, yeah, I remember. So I did, and so then we would, they one day decided they'd see what I could do with ooh, and so they haven't really cued Jack in. And Jack's line was, you really do hate me, don't you? And I said, ooh, do I? And he fell right on the floor. Right on the floor. But
this was in rehearsal, right?
Huh?
This was in rehearsal.
Oh, yeah.
He could also break up on the air, though.
Oh, yes. Oh, he broke up many times on the air. Many times on the air. You know, it's fun to talk to you in Denver. I don't think you know this probably, but first broadcast I ever did was at KOA in Denver.
Really?
Yep, I started my career in 1926. I was still a kid in high school, and I did a show for the United States National Bank with a young lady by the name of Georgia Miller, and she was the wife and I was the husband in a series, and I went out to audition for it, and they looked at me and said, what are you doing out here? And I said, well, they told me you had something to be auditioned for, and they said, oh, well, this is a man of about 35 years of age. I said, oh, well, okay, and I started to leave, and The director said, well, look, have you ever read over a microphone? I said, no. And he said, well, maybe you'd like to stay and read. And I said, well, yeah, sure. So I did, and there were 30 of us that auditioned that day, and the next day they called back 12, next day they called back 4, and I got it. So I worked that, and then I worked at KFEL in Denver. I sold time and announced there. And I opened Denver University's little theater doing marchbanks in Canada in either 28 or 29. So I have many good memories of Denver. My mother had a dress shop, as a matter of fact, at 412 East Colfax, opposite the cathedral there.
You really do know Denver, then.
Oh, yes, I do.
Well, I may have missed it. Maybe you already told me, but how did you happen to be in Denver in the first place?
Well, I went through, I went to Morey Junior High there, and I went to West High School there and graduated from West. So I lived there for a long time.
Well, did you, you mentioned KOA. Don Wilson was on KOA, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Did you know him here then?
No, I didn't know Don. I think Don left there a little before I did, and I don't remember Don, and I don't think we met there at all. I met him at KFI out here when I came out here.
Did you read Irving Fine's book?
Did I read what?
Irving Fine's book on Jack Benny?
No, I didn't read Irving's book. Irving is my pet hate.
Is he?
Yes, he is.
Well, you'll probably hate this anecdote in there. He says you got the most money for one word of anybody in radio or television until that time.
Well, that's a marvelous theory that he has. You see, Irving hated like the devil to turn loose of a buck. It just hurt him terribly. Jack didn't, but Irving did. And Jack didn't know what Irving did sometimes. For instance, I'll give you a story about Irving. One week I got a call from the casting director, and he said, Frank, I'd like to have you on the show. This is in the television days. I'd like to have you on the show this week, but you're just voiceover. You're at the airport, and you're just coming over the PA, and so Irving thought that maybe you'd work for half of your regular salary. And I said, tell that, and I got just about that far, and he said, never mind, I'll call you back. So in about 20 minutes, he called back, and he said, okay. He said, see you tomorrow in your regular salary. And he said, now I'm going to tell you what happened. He said, Irving said, I'm not going to pay Nelson's salary to do this thing, so get another actor. So he said, I got another actor. The other actor went on stage, and as soon as Jack said something and this fellow started to talk, Jack said, where's Frank? And Irving says, well, I thought he says, where's Frank? He said, get Frank. Irving says, yes, sir. So it ended up that he had to pay the other actor, and then he had to pay me my regular salary, so it cost him more than it would have to begin with.
Well, this anecdote he reports in...
It's always that way.
Yeah, he indicates that in the book, because he was the Jack Benny's producer at the time, I believe.
Yes, he was, originally he was his accountant, and then he ended up being his producer, finally. And, of course, he's now George Burns' manager.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I think the anecdote is kind of revealing, because he talks in here about how he didn't want to pay your fee to come in and do this. Basically, what they needed was the yes. He didn't want to pay the fee for that, and so he took it to Benny, at least as he has it in the book. And Benny says, of course we have to pay his fee. He's entitled to get his fee for the one word or whatever else he does. And they, according to Fine, they had a big conference with all the writers to decide whether the one word on this particular show was a big enough laugh to get the fee, and they went ahead and paid the fee because they decided it was.
Well, I'll give you 100 to 1 right now that isn't the way it happened, because if he wouldn't have dared go to Jack and ask that. He simply wouldn't do that. Jack would expect me to be there if the character was in.
And he certainly expect you to get paid for it.
That's right. And Jack would never have raised the issue about money in the first place. With the kind of money Jack was making, it didn't make any difference. What he was going to pay me, when you figure what he was going to pay the government, it just didn't make that much difference. Matter of fact, I made a lot more money on other shows than I made on the Jack Benny show.
The revealing thing, I think, about that anecdote, even that he would tell it reveals that Jack Benny's character was the exact opposite of what he went to great lengths to promote on the air.
But Jack was a very generous man, actually. He was a very charitable man. And, for instance, he would give $25,000, let's say, to Jewish war relief during the war, with the stipulation that there be no publicity. There was another comedian out here that would give $5,000 with the stipulation there'd be a lot of publicity. That was the difference between the two. But Jack was just that kind of a human being. You know, when Mel was in that terrible auto accident, he was in a coma for 21 days. Jack sat at his bedside all that time.
This is Mel Blanc.
That's right. And he did the same with Eddie Anderson when Eddie had a stroke. He was out there at the hospital daily. He was a very, very decent and lovely man. He was not an easy man to know, to socialize with or anything like that. Now, Mel socialized with him a fair amount of time, but I never did socialize with Jack. But I certainly enjoyed working with him, and I admired him as a human being.
One of the things I loved about the Benny Show was how, if they blew a line, they would play on it and build on it throughout the...
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering if some of that wasn't... If some of those lines maybe weren't blown in dress rehearsal and built into the show, or if
No.
they were actually blown on the air.
That's right. For instance, Mary had one where she came in and I was the soda jerk, and she said, "I'll have a Chiss-Squeeze sandwich." And that played for weeks. And that happened on the show. It did not happen in rehearsal.
Those running gags were just fantastic.
That's right. Another one was when Harris had Manischewitz, you know. I mean, he just garbled it, and they did Manischewitz for a long time. I'll tell you the most famous one, probably. I don't know whether it's in his book or not, but it probably is. Don Wilson had a line early in the show. Oh, first, I have to back up to myself. I had a line, and Jack says, "Oh, Mr. I say, "Yes." He said, "Are you the doorman?" I said, "Well, who do you think I am in this uniform? Nelson Eddy?"
That's the one. I'll just let you tell that. I was going to read it, but I'll let you tell it.
Okay, so he said, "Nelson Eddy," and he said, "You know, I don't like that joke for Frank. We got to get a different joke." He said, "I don't like the Nelson Eddy joke." Well, we get to show, and they haven't changed the joke. Now, early in the show, Don Wilson had a line about Drew Pearson, the famous columnist, and it came out Dreer Poosin. Well, that got a tremendous laugh out of the audience and broke Jack up. Now I look up at the booth, and the writers are motioning to me to come into the booth. So I get up and go back and walk in the booth. I said, "What do you want?" They said, "Look, when you get to the line, it says, 'Are you the doorman?' Say, 'Well, who do you think I am in this uniform?' Dreer Poosin." I said, "Come on, fellas, it doesn't even track." They said, "Never mind whether it tracks, do it." I said, "Now, look, nobody ad-libs with Jack, and you know that." They said, "We will take the responsibility for having given you the line." I think if it had died out there, they'd have all said he did it on his own. I don't know. But anyway, I went back out, and now we get to the thing, and Jack said, "Oh, Mr. and I always had my back to him, and I whirled into the mic, and I said, "Yes." And he said, "Excuse me, are you the doorman?" And as he said it, I saw this dull look come into his eyes like, "Oh, good Lord, here comes that line I don't want to hear." And I stared right into his eyes, and I said, "Well, who do you think I am in this uniform? Dreer Poosin?" Well, his eyes got like two saucers. He began to laugh. He grabbed a hold of the microphone. He slid down the microphone to the floor, pounded on the floor, got up, staggered clear across the stage to the far wall, turned around into the curtains, got a hold of the curtains, slid down the curtains, pounded on the floor some more, got up and staggered back to the mic, and the laugh is going on through this whole thing.
This is all live.
That's all live. And it went on through the whole thing. Now he gets back to the microphone. I thought he'd never, get back to the script. And I really think that this is probably the longest laugh we ever had on the Benny Show.
Longer than your money or your life?
Yeah, I think it was longer than that. I think it was, but it wasn't planned, you see. It just happened. And so then, for weeks after that, I would run into writers from other shows, and they'd say that whole thing was a planned routine, wasn't it? I said, "No, it was not." And I'd tell them this story very much as I've told you, and they all thought I was lying to them. There wasn't a one of them was convinced that I was telling them the truth, and it's absolutely the way it happened.
There was a wonderful one that Mary blew. In fact, I even said on the air, I really think that must have been done in rehearsal, and apparently I'm wrong, but there was a wonderful line that she blew where she was supposed to say, he says, "Where's my car?" And she says, "It's up on the grease rack." And she says, "It's up there on the grass reek." And they used that for about 3 or 4 weeks running. I think there was a line in there about a couple of skunks getting out, and they're over there, boy, that grass reeks, or something like that. The writers were ingenious at turning.
Oh yeah, once anything like that happened, they would pick it up. No, Mary, you couldn't write that kind of a breakup for Mary because she wouldn't be able to do it. She just wouldn't be able to handle that kind of a thing and make it sound like anything but a phony thing. No, there was never a single one of those things that was written into the script. Oh, well, we bounced from show to show. Of course, I did Blondie. I did my first Blondie in 1939 and did the last one on January 12th of 1950. And in that, I played Herb Woodley, the next-door neighbor.
Right.
And so we bounced from show to show. I was one of the two announcers. I was the billboard announcer on Lux Radio Theater for 2.5 years.
When was that?
Well, at the beginning of Lux out here. I'd have to look at my books to tell you the exact date of it, but when it first came out here, I did the billboard announcing and then doubled into the show. And just looking to see if I could pick up a date on it here, but I don't know if I can.
I wanted to ask you, while you're looking, about Phil Harris, whose shows survive in such wonderful sound and are so obviously influenced by Jack Benny.
Oh, sure. Well, you know, he had the Frankie, the banjo player, you know, was supposed to be his sidekick in that.
Right.
And it was patterned to a great extent after what he had learned, really, with Jack. I can tell you a little story about Rochester and how he got on the Benny Show.
Okay.
The only time that I ever turned Jack down in my life, I would get out of other shows. This is before I was contracted to him, and I'd get out of other shows in order to do his show. Well, he called me one week quite late, and I already had 4 commitments for Sunday, and I said, there's just no way I can do it, I'm sorry. What he wanted me to do was a porter on a train coming from Albuquerque. And it's a very fortunate thing that I was busy and they couldn't get me, because they went out and they got a young man by the name of Eddie Anderson. And Jack was so impressed by him that he said, hey, we got to find a spot for him on the show. And he became his valet on the show. That's the way he got on the show.
Maybe you almost had the role of the Rochester guy.
Well,
no,
it never would have developed that way.
No,
it'd just have been a one-shot if I'd have done it. But because he had this very distinctive voice and all, Jack was so intrigued with him, he said, hey, we got to do something else besides this porter bit.
Right. But what I mean is you almost got the role that in other words, if you had done that show, maybe there wouldn't have been any Rochester.
That's right. That is correct.
I think that was around Easter 1937, wasn't it?
I couldn't give you the date. I really don't remember.
It went back a ways, though.
Yeah, long ways.
Elliot Lewis was another one who was on Benny's show a lot, wasn't he?
Well, Elliot used to come on, and he did what they called the moolie. We called him a moolie. You'd be kind of a goofy guy, you know. And we did a routine. We did one routine between Elliot and myself that turned out to be just an absolute screamingly funny routine, and we were scared to death of it, because if it died early, you were dead, because you had to go on with it. You couldn't get off of it. And what it was, he gets up to the line ahead of Jack to get a ticket. And he says, I'd like a ticket for Glockamora. And I said, yes, sir. He said, is that little brook still, how are things in Glockamora? I said, fine, just fine. He says, is that little brook still running there? I said, yes, it is. And we did every line of the song that way. And it just kept building, and of course Jack doing the looks behind him. And it went from the beginning of the song to the end with every one of the lyrics, and it just kept building and building and building. Then they tried it. It was so successful, they tried it again with another song about a year later, and it died of boring. And we still had to do it, because there was no way out of it, you see.
Was that the Tennessee Waltz?
I'm not sure. I don't remember what it was. I don't think I really want to remember what it was, because it just died, that's all.
Josephsburg, in his book, recounts that you and I believe it was Elliot Lewis did the Tennessee Waltz that way.
Well, then probably we did. That's probably the second one. Only the one that really played was How Are Things in Glockamora.
Yeah, I think that's in Irving Fine's book.
Yeah.
That's wonderful comedy when you can build something like that into.
Oh, it was just tremendous, and yet you can see what a chancy kind of a routine it was, because if it didn't start to play right from the beginning, you were going nowhere except downhill for a long time.
Right. Fred Allen used to do some great things with music. Did you ever work with him?
Yes, I worked with Allen when he was working with Jack on about I think 2 or 3 shows where Allen was on, when they had the feud going, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What's your opinion of Fred Allen?
Oh, I think he was born like 20 years too soon. The kind of comedy that he did that was so magnificent, and he was the comedian's comedian. Every comedian adored him, thought he was the greatest thing that ever came down the pike. But he was too sharp for the people, generally speaking. And then comedy began to change, and I think he would have done very, very well on today's market, or back a piece from now even. But I just think he was a little before his time. You see, he never had a high rating, and yet every comedian loved him.
Listen, when you do a campaign like McDonald's, and when there, you know, the tie-in to the Jack Benny Show, which has been gone now for the radio show has been gone now for 25 years. Your tie to that is so subtle. A whole generation of viewers are going to look at those spots and probably not know what they're doing. How does McDonald's come up with something like that, or what?
Well, as I understand it, the head of Needham, Harper and Steers. You want the boring story of how I got the commercial?
Sure.
All right. I got a call one day from Afra out here. Afra called me and said that they wanted me to call Chicago, Needham, Harper and Steers, and talk to a lady by the name of Virginia Dalton about some McDonald's commercials. So I called her, and I said, I don't understand why you don't have my phone number. I don't even have an agent anymore. And I said, I don't understand why you don't have my phone number, because I've done 4 commercials for you. And she said, well, we're a big agency. There are 4 floors here, and 1 floor doesn't necessarily know what the other's doing, but would you be interested? And I said, yeah, sure. So about 20 minutes passed, and she called back, and she said, Frank, I checked on those commercials. Those were voiceover. And I said, yes. She said, well, this is on camera. And then this is the way an actor sells himself. I said, what in the hell do you want with me on camera? And there was a pause, and she said, well, we thought we might. And I said, well, if you do, okay, but I can't figure out what you want with me on camera. So then on the following Monday, I was called to go out into Burbank and do an audition at a small studio out there, and I went out there, walk in, and a young man, 26 years old, walks out of the back room, and he said, I'm Bill Brichta of Needham, Harper and Steers, and I wrote the commercials. And I said, oh, I know. You're going to tell me that your mother used to carry you into the theater in her arms, and you watched me perform. And he said, no, he said, I know the character, and our boss is a great fan of the Benny Show. So that's supposedly where it came from. So I then did the commercials, and when we got all through, he said, no, I can't go back to Chicago without autographs. And I thought, oh, come on, you're putting me on. And so he brought these 5 scripts in that I had done, and I said, first one he said is to so-and-so. I said, now, who is that? He said, that's the head of Needham, Harper and Steers. I said, by all means. So I autographed each of these, the people he asked me to autograph them to, and left and came home and said to my wife, there isn't a snowball of a chance in hell of my getting that job, because anytime you get all that kind of treatment, nothing happens. 3 days later, they called and said they wanted me to do it. And the funny thing is, that's the first time McDonald's has ever done anything except real people, you know, just folks doing commercials. And actually, it's the biggest single campaign they have ever done. They called me 2 weeks into the campaign and said that McDonald's was so happy with it, they were putting an additional $500,000 into network advertising. So it evidently was a very successful campaign for them, and I'm happy to have worked for them, and I got a kick out of doing it. And you're talking about the character. The very strange thing happened. You see, I wondered. I thought, now, what are the kids going to think about this today? It's a long time since my son used to come home from school and say, you know, Dad, I am sick of you, because all the kids in school were doing the yes. Okay, all the kids back doing it again. All the kids, they go into McDonald's and they say, I'll have a hamburger. They say, Big Mac, yes, and they're all doing this bit. And I have had kids run up and rap on my window, and I roll the window down, and they do the yes at me and then run. And it's strange, but the young people have picked up on it just exactly as they did back in the Benny days.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah, it is.
Your wife, Viola Vaughn,
yep,
was also on the Jack Benny Show for...
And she used to do a lot of femme fatales. You know, if there was a sexy French gal or a sexy Italian girl or whatever it happened to be, she did a lot of those. She worked with Bob Hope a great deal. She did Mademoiselle Fifi with Eddie Cantor. And, of course, she hasn't been working at it. I'll tell you what we do now. We have a thing that we do called the Golden Days of Radio. And so she and I do the Bickersons now.
Really?
Yeah, we have a lot of fun doing that.
How often was she on the Benny program?
Well, she used to, sometimes she would stand by. If Mary wasn't feeling too well, Mary used to faint a lot.
Really?
Yeah, she'd have spells when she would faint, and sometimes, boy, she'd hit that stage, and that was it. And usually it would be after the show, right at the conclusion of the show. I don't remember Mary ever fainting during a show, but I sure remember her fainting a great many times after a show.
Well, did she have mic fright?
I don't know. I don't know whether it was that or just a general nervousness or what the devil it was. I really don't know. But if she was not feeling too well, they would often have Viola down there just to stand by, just in case something happened to her, just to pick up and do her lines. But there are other times they would have her in there doing, as I say, the femme fatale type of thing.
Did she substitute for Mary later after she left the show?
No, she never substituted for Mary as such.
Now, Mary Livingston actually left the program because of the fact that the pressures.
She wouldn't do the television shows. She just wouldn't do them.
She left the radio.
They trapped her into doing one, but I mean, she just wouldn't do them.
I believe she left the radio show too.
Well, she may have towards the end. I really don't remember that now. Viola might know more about that than I do. She might have stood in for her on an occasion. I really don't know. I've said she hadn't, but I could be wrong on that.
You know, we played one the other night from 1954, and the actress who was playing the part was good, but there was such a difference. She didn't have that bite. And
now, Mary was Mary, you know. I mean, and when you've done a thing that long, you don't try to step into somebody else's shoes unless it's just a necessity. You just have to do it. That's all, because you're never going to be compared favorably.
That's right. We have one more caller here. Hello, this is John Dunning here on 71 K News Talk Radio.
I'd like to ask what was the most funny or embarrassing thing that ever happened to you in radio?
Good question. Did you get that?
What was the
funniest and the most embarrassing?
Well, I really think that the Greer Pooson story that I told you earlier was probably the funniest. I got more of a kick out than anything out of the reaction of Jack, you know. I mean, it just broke him up so completely that I would say that's about as funny as anything that happened to me. Embarrassing, I don't know. It's embarrassing when you make a mistake. It's embarrassing when you do something on a dramatic show like I did once when I had a very dramatic scene which the first act ended with, "You've killed my boy." And, no, "You've killed my son" was the line. Mm-hmm. And I started to say boy and tried to change back, and it came out, "You killed my soy." You know, that leaves you in a fine state of affairs, and now I have to go back and do the second act, and I'm thinking, oh my God, a highly dramatic show, and I did a thing like that. And then the director, having no heart at all, handed me a little note just as I'm going to open the second act, and I flip it open, and it says, "My little soy, how have you been?" And then I practically couldn't go on. I practically couldn't get the words out.
You hear a lot about things that happen on the air, in line with this caller's question, where there are a lot of games played on the air. I don't know if this happened on shows like the Benny Show, where you would be on mic and somebody would come and jerk your pants down or such.
Oh, we used to do that to each other all the time in the early days, before, not on network shows, but when I was working locally here, we used to do that all the time. Well, what is your most memorable? Into the booth naked, you know, and throw you a cue. We're supposed to do the news now.
They would throw you a cue naked from the booth?
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to ask your most memorable experience in Denver radio, since you said you worked here.
Well, I guess, yes, I did. As I say, the first thing that I did was this show for a bank back there, in which I played the husband. I was about 15, I think, and the young lady was a beautiful redhead of 32. If I had known then what I know now, I could have enjoyed the part more, I'm sure. But I remember one thing that happened to me on that. I think probably in all of my career in radio, I missed exactly one broadcast. And that didn't happen to be in Denver, but I was taken by ambulance and carried in on a stretcher while I was doing that series, and from the stretcher played the husband one night. Wow. And the other time, the one time that I actually missed a show was when I went back with Jack to New York, and I got out of bed. I had a fever of 104. I got out of bed, went down in a snowstorm, and did the first show. And when he found out that I was that ill and that the doctor had allowed me to get out of bed, he was ready to kill somebody. And, of course, he would not allow me to come back and do the second show, and so the writers fought for the privilege of doing my part on the second show. And that's the only show that I ever missed in my whole career in radio.
Frank, we are coming up on the hour. I really have enjoyed having you on. I would love to have you back. I hate to monopolize your life, but I've only touched on one show today, and I would like to talk about some of the other things you've done. And I would also like to have your wife on if that could be arranged.
Well, sure, why not?
Okay, well, thanks much for being with us.
You betcha, John. And you let us know.
I sure will. We'll talk to you again.
Right.
Okay, that was Frank Nelson, wonderful actor from the Jack Benny Show and other programs.